Why Singapore was in Pyongyang this week. The hidden economic infrastructure behind a high-stakes diplomatic sprint through Beijing, North Korea, and Seoul. The ASEAN Angle, Episode 7. Act 1. The Spark. Most countries choose their friends carefully. Singapore chooses its conversations carefully, and that is an entirely different strategy. If you are a nation of 6 million people living on a piece of land smaller than New York City, your biggest threat is not necessarily a military invasion, it is silence. It is the moment the major powers of the world decide you are too small to be included in the room where decisions are made. So how do you prevent that silence? You make yourself the one place where everyone can talk to everyone else, especially when they are furious with each other. On May 26, 2026, Singaporean Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan sat across from North Korean Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hui at the Mansudae Assembly Hall in Pyongyang. Outside, one of the world's most isolated capitals carried on under a heavy grey sky, largely cut off from global commerce. Inside, a city-state built on hyper-globalization was doing what it does best, keeping a door open that almost everyone else has slammed shut. This single meeting was part of a relentless, high-stakes diplomatic sprint. In May 2026 alone, Balakrishnan flew to 12 different countries. In a single 5-day window, his itinerary read Beijing, then Pyongyang, then Seoul. It was a sequence designed with absolute deliberate intent. This trip is happening against a backdrop of deep global anxiety accelerated by the recent United States-led war in Iran. Across Southeast Asia, governments are watching traditional alliances fracture and unpredictable geopolitical currents take over. While other nations are retreating into defensive blocs, Singapore is leaning hard into a 5-decade-old doctrine: stay useful to everyone, take sides with no one, and make your presence impossible to ignore. That is the official stance. But the underlying reality is far more transactional than a mere desire for global harmony. Act to the foundation. To understand why a Southeast Asian foreign minister is sitting in Pyongyang this week, we have to stand somewhere else entirely. Picture the port of Singapore at 2 o'clock in the morning. Even in the dead of night, the horizon is a neon wall of container ships. Giant gantry cranes swing back and forth, moving thousands of boxes an hour. A lone crane operator, hundreds of feet in the air, looks down at a hull that just arrived from Rotterdam and is heading to Shanghai. If those ships stop moving, Singapore stops existing as a first-world economy. Singapore has no natural resources, no strategic depth, and absolutely no military weight relative to its massive neighbors. It is a financial and logistics engine dropped onto a highly vulnerable geographical choke point. Because it has nothing in the ground, it had to build something far more durable: absolute diplomatic indispensability. Consider the historical precedent. In 2018, the world watched Singapore host the historic Trump-Kim summit on Sentosa Island. It was the first time a sitting United States president had ever met face-to-face with a North Korean leader. To the casual observer, Singapore just happened to be a scenic, secure backdrop. But that moment was actually the dividend of decades of grinding, unglamorous relationship maintenance. The two nations established formal diplomatic relations back in 1975. Even though Singapore suspended direct trade relations with North Korea in November 2017 to comply with international sanctions, it never severed ties. North Korea still maintains an active embassy in Singapore to this day, while Singapore manages its diplomatic posture via a non-resident ambassador accredited to Pyongyang from Beijing. When Balakrishnan landed in Pyongyang on Monday, he was greeted at the airport by Vice Foreign Minister Pak Sang-gil and Roh Kil-song, North Korea's ambassador to Singapore. This was the first visit by a Singaporean top diplomat to North Korea in 8 years, explicitly breaking a long dormancy. Immediately after, Balakrishnan scheduled a flight directly to Seoul to meet South Korean Foreign Minister Cho Hyun. It is the first official visit by a Singaporean foreign minister to South Korea in nearly 20 years, since 2007. Think about that timeline. Relationships that had been left quiet for a generation are being systematically reactivated in the exact week the Korean peninsula is heating up again. For the everyday citizen in Seoul living under the permanent shadow of regional tension, or for a factory worker in Vietnam dependent on stable East Asian electronic supply chains, these high-level visits are the invisible shock absorbers that keep regional anxieties from boiling over into economic halts. Act 3. The money question. Why does an upscale city-state spend millions of taxpayer dollars sending its top diplomats to log thousands of air miles to talk to heavily sanctioned regimes? Because for an economy like Singapore's, diplomatic access is not a luxury. It is core infrastructure. Follow the money and the strategy becomes clear. When global tensions rise, capital seeks neutrality. Multinationals do not set up regional headquarters in Singapore because they love the tropical weather. They do it because they know the Singapore government can talk to Washington, Beijing, Tokyo, and Pyongyang without triggering an immediate crisis. But look at the sequence of the May 2026 itinerary. The Beijing stop came first. and it was not an administrative accident. While in the Chinese capital, Balakrishnan and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi issued a joint call for a ceasefire in the Middle East, more importantly for Southeast Asia, they agreed that all ships and aircraft must enjoy the right of unimpeded transit passage in international straits. That is a direct, urgent reference to the ongoing Strait of Hormuz crisis. We have seen how that conflict has rippled through neighboring economies, disrupting tourist arrivals in Thailand and driving up retail fuel prices for motorbike commuters in Ho Chi Minh City. Singapore's port-driven economy cannot survive if international maritime straits become shooting zones. By securing a joint statement with Beijing on transit rights, Singapore is using diplomacy to shield its maritime traffic. This access pays long-term commercial dividends because Singapore is viewed as a balanced player. It has successfully negotiated new trade agreements across Latin America, expanded its corporate presence in the Middle East, and is currently moving to establish its very first embassy in East Africa. For the regional middle-class investor, whether sitting in Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, or Bangkok, this matters immensely. Your savings, your stock portfolio, and your corporate job are highly exposed to import inflation and regional logistics blocks. When Singapore secures these diplomatic channels, it stabilizes the broader ASEAN sandbox, keeping trade lanes predictable when the rest of the world is fracturing. Act 4. The consequence chain. Let us look closely at how this high-level geopolitical balancing act plays out in real terms. There are two distinct paths this can take, and both carry deep consequences for Southeast Asia. The optimistic cascade. In the best-case scenario, Singapore successfully positions itself as the primary conduit for de-escalation. South Korea is currently Singapore's sixth-largest trading partner. As Balakrishnan lands in Seoul on Thursday, South Korean officials and potentially Unification Minister Chong Dong-yong, who has been actively coordinating a separate meeting with Balakrishnan, will be analyzing his notes with immense detail. Because Singapore is the immediate country coming fresh out of discussions with Cho Sun-hui in Pyongyang, Balakrishnan acts as a human courier for nuance. He can communicate whether North Korea is showing an indirect willingness to re-engage with Washington or Seoul, or if they are digging in. If this channel works, the economic upside is stability. Multinationals maintain their regional investments, trade flows remain uninterrupted, and the risk premium on Asian shipping drops. Singapore reinforces its status as the indispensable diplomatic venue, bringing prestige and steady corporate investment to the entire ASEAN bloc. The adverse cascade. But look at the alternative path. There is a sharp limit to what a small nation can achieve through sheer dialogue. If North Korea utilizes these talks merely to assert the legitimacy of its nuclear status and refuse denuclearization, Singapore risks being used as a diplomatic shield for authoritarian posturing. Furthermore, if the geopolitical competition between the United States and China intensifies further following the war in Iran, Singapore's friends-to-all strategy faces an existential wall. Washington may begin viewing Singapore's continued diplomatic engagement with sanctioned states like North Korea with growing irritation. Conversely, Beijing could interpret Singapore's deep security ties with the West as a contradiction to its regional alignment. If forced to choose, the entire economic model collapses. For a regional logistics manager or an import-dependent business owner in Manila, this means a sudden fracturing of trade routes, sudden regulatory compliance walls, and an immediate flight of capital out of Southeast Asian emerging markets. Act 5. The Deeper Implication. This entire Northeast Asian tour brings us to a fundamental question that every single small economy in Southeast Asia should be asking right now. What is your survival strategy when the great powers completely stop agreeing? Indonesia has immense nickel reserves and massive domestic markets. Vietnam has booming manufacturing lines and an aggressive labor force. Malaysia has deep energy reserves and critical semiconductor testing infrastructure. Singapore has none of those things. It cannot rely on natural wealth or large populations to protect itself from global economic shocks. So instead, it built an asset that is far harder to replicate on a balance sheet. A reputation for being trusted by people who absolutely do not trust each other. It is a foreign policy model based entirely on strategic utility. In a stable, globalized world, that utility looks like simple administrative efficiency. But in a fragmenting world where lines are being drawn and communication channels are snapping, the ability to sit comfortably in every single room becomes an incredibly high-value economic asset. Yet this strategy relies on a very fragile assumption that the great powers will continue to value an independent, neutral intermediary. If the global order fractures to the point where neutrality is treated as a betrayal, the ability to talk to everyone will no longer be an asset. It will be a liability. As the diplomatic flights touch down and the official press statements are filed, the ultimate question remains unanswered. Can a small nation truly sustain its independence by being useful to rival superpowers? Or is it simply buying time before the currents of history force a choice it cannot afford to make?